So this panel, The Politics of the, in parentheses, Neoliberal Academy, takes up some of the big questions that we discussed in the first roundtable and really locates them in a particular institution, the Academy, and the constraints and possible new openings that a neoliberal configuration of the Academy might impose. And that's going to be one of the first orders of business that will discuss what exactly that means and what our different panelists have to say about it. I will just do a very brief introduction, and then we'll get started. So we have Dylan Rodriguez, who's the professor and chair of ethnic studies at UC Riverside, and Janet Jacobson, who is professor and director of Barnard Center for Research on Living.
Instead of going into a long biography of the things I've been engaged with and thinking about, really from the time I was a late adolescent, I'll just talk to one particular dimension I think reaches across different interests and commitments I have. I'll start by talking about the concern I have and what brings me to the table in conversations like this. And that is, I've had a long involvement in a variety of activisms, activisms that are housed within universities to activisms that kind of stretch across different terrains, different political terrains. And my concern is that almost exclusively, these forms of activism have seen themselves and usually explicitly named themselves as radical, meaning something significantly beyond a liberal or reformist or even progressive agenda. And the thing that brings me to the table in a conversation like this is that I'm becoming more and more convinced that this field of activisms are no longer, not only are they no longer adequately radical, I question whether they're radical at all. So I think some clarification of terms might be in order in terms of trying to understand what we mean by things like liberal, radical, progressive, revolutionary, etc. But in my view, it's the forms of political work that see themselves as pointing towards some kind of a fundamental socio-cultural, structural, political, economic shift, disruption, and transformation that understand themselves as radical. So there's some modicum of clarity there. I'm not convinced the activisms I've been involved with are actually capable of doing that. In fact, I think what they oftentimes have been reproducing is a tendency toward an anti-radicalism. So I can talk a lot more about that in detail. And the reason I come to that position is because what I'm seeing more and more is the need, an urgent need, an emergency need for a much deeper, much more nuanced, a much more politically situated theoretical conceptualization and analysis of racial genocide. So let me talk for a minute about that as my mode of introduction. On the one hand, what I mean by foregrounding racial genocide, it's obviously a confrontation with certain forms of genocide exceptionalism, which I won't spend any time talking here about, but you'll know what I mean. I'm talking especially about Zionist appropriations of genocide discourse so that they exclusively appear at only one moment in human history. The way I'm engaged with this concept of racial genocide, this politics of racial genocide, is that I'm thinking about genocide not according to the UN definition of it, but rather against it, in the sense of genocide as a social logic that's premised on the possibility of physical extermination, but which is actually part of a long civilizational project that's followed modernity in its aftermath, if you want to say that there's an aftermath of modernity. I'm talking everything from liberal humanism as a kind of philosophical, now pragmatic construct that follows us everywhere we go, the products of racial colonialism, New World racial slavery, land conquest, and so forth. So my political challenge, the one I foreground in my life now, is the attempt to address racial genocide not as a compartmentalized historical matter of fact, but rather as a multi-layered structure of dominance that constitutes all social forms in which we live in this world. So the other set of my concerns here is in addressing racial genocide as part of the living present. I think that what has happened is that genocide has actually shaped the political concerns, the structures, the limitations, and the strategies of contemporary left activisms. So it's not only that left activisms don't address genocide, it's that they're shaped by it. By the limitations, I'm talking especially about the way the political imagination of a so-called left has already presumed an absence of social urgency and disruption that attempt to abolish genocide. So the term I've been using for this recently is that I'm convinced that even at its best, the left, in particular the U.S. left, is doing at best the work of genocide management rather than genocide abolition. You could liken it to casualty management in the field of war, right? What you want is for the death and the dying and the logics of social extermination, liquidation, mutualism to stop right? But the political imagination can't even get that far. What it's involved with is trying to manage the casualties, manage the danger, and survive it. So then part of the challenge becomes thinking about how to do a politics that deals and confronts the social logic of genocide, but which also refrains from conflating all the different forms of racial genocide that have followed us into modernity and its aftermath as if they're the same, because they're just not. Right? So there's also an incommensurability between, say, the figure and the embodiment of blackness as ontological death and enslavement within modernity, and then the kind of constitutive presence of indigenous land dispossession and constant colonization, settler colonialism, as I was talking about earlier, as a condition of possibility for what we do now. So I think that there's multiple political challenges that confront whatever you want to call activism. And my concern is with the ways in which conversations like ours will oftentimes not only not engage with that confrontation, but will already assume the presence of the genocidal legacies, right? and therefore will presume death, right? Leave people for dead.
First, I want to thank Margot and Naomi for organizing this particular forum, and all of my co-panelists from this morning and this afternoon. I've learned just so much already. I write about social movements, but I don't write about activisms that I actually participate in. And the requirement of this part of the panel, which is to speak of where we're coming from, has led me to try to do those two things together. And it's very hard to do, and I'm supposed to do it in 5 minutes. So I'm going to try to hit on just one point. And this is picking up from something that Dylan said, which is about the question of political imagination. So one of the things that I do in my work at the Barnard Center for Research on Women is think about how do we produce a political imagination that is maybe radical, I think we could talk about that, but is at least expansive. And do so without stopping doing things that are urgent, necessary in the moment. You know, things that have real consequences that need to happen on a relatively short time frame, that are not as easily amenable to a broad political imagination. And then how do we bring those two things together?
So let's start off with a kind of framing question. And so, as I said before, and as many of your comments indicated, we kind of framed this particular roundtable around the problem of neoliberalism, and understanding neoliberalism as corporatization, privatization, quest for effective or efficient kinds of usable knowledge products, those kinds of market logics within the academy as a particular institution. But we've also heard, and this morning as well, that that's not the only frame in which we need to think about the academy as an institution. So I want to kind of open with that question. What can we say about neoliberalism, either refining our use of the term, either sort of, and developing a way of thinking about those processes and or in relation to other contexts that also frame the work we're doing in the academy?
I mean, I guess I would like to go back to this question of political imaginary, because one of the things about imagination is, and I don't study imagination, and so maybe people who do have more sophisticated things to say about it, but it seems that it's generally thought of as impractical. And yet, what I heard Dylan saying was that a radical political imagination is in fact necessary, and that without it, you go down roads as an activist where you're trying to do something that you think is very good, and you end up in fact doing the exact opposite of what you intend. So I think that kind of non-instrumental knowledge, you know, maybe its usefulness is mediated, and maybe usefulness isn't the right term, maybe it's necessary, but for me that would be a helpful thing to think about, which is, what does imagination do, and is it in any way resistant to the types of, you know, if it's applied, we can measure it and then put it on our website and use it as advertising, that Naomi, where she mentioned this morning. So I think that would be an interesting place to start.
I can jump in on this. just building on this, I think the political problem of political imagination. You know, there's a certain tradition within radical and revolutionary intellectual practices in which it's more or less understood that one of the central obligations of professional intellectuals, meaning teachers, lawyers, religious figures, and others, is to authorize and valorize insurrection, right? And most especially the forms of insurrection that are most deeply feared and repressed within a particular historical moment. I think one thing that's happened at the site of the university is that universities are now, not only are they a site where professional intellectuals don't do that, right? But they're actually the site where professional intellectuals make fairly clear decisions about what forms of social rebellion count as political, right? Therefore count as legitimate, as coherent, and which count as reprehensible, non-political, or in that case, terrorist. An example I'll give you is cop killing, right? There's a contemporary historical flow in urban and rural areas across the United States and North America in which police are targeted, right, by communities that are policed. Now, the problem I have with this is that the way in which this gets talked about by professional intellectuals is in the most kind of dismissive, criminalizing, and depoliticizing or apolitical ways, right? I'm not even at this point valorizing it. I'm saying that there's not even a conversation around it, right? And what I would like for there to be is a conversation that actually valorizes it politically and critically, right? Not romanticizes it, valorizes it in a critical way. So to say that at the level of political horizon, I'll add one more thing. One of, I think, maybe it's not an irony, maybe it's more of a symbiosis. One of the things that I think has happened in the last maybe 30 to 40 years with the increasing privatization and neoliberalization of the university, I actually think the university has been brought into closer proximity with the repressive and violent arms of the state, such that the university does the kind of pedagogical work of the repressive state, and has kind of withdrawn from the pedagogical work of the consent building state. I think that, you know, in some fairly clear ways that this happened as a precise outcome of the neoliberalization, privatization of schools, including and especially public institutions. What I mean when I say that I think the university is coming to closer proximity with the violent repressive function of the state, you know, the period of the Cold War, what I understand the rise of disciplines to be is in generating the kind of knowledge production pedagogical apparatus that facilitates a kind of consent building, you know, hegemony. What I'm saying is that one of the imperatives of neoliberalism that I think is somewhat under-theorized, especially in the educational institutions, is that the educational institutions kind of strategically forego even the pedagogical mediation of state violence and just become practitioners of state violence. So the example I would give is the kind of selectively disappearing space for even moderate political dissent at the site of universities, where professors and students have to actually fear legal reprisal, right? Not just censure, but legal reprisal. I mean, to the point where the 11 students that non-violently, verbally disrupted the Israeli ambassador's speech at UC Irvine are now being brought up on felony charges in Orange County, right? For standing up during a public speech and, you know, making statements about the condition of Palestine and Palestinians, right? So at a certain phase, the university's imperatives collapse, and they say, you know, we're not even going to make a pretense, right? We're not even going to make a pedagogical pretense that we're trying to kind of massage this, and we're going to create a kind of tolerance form about why you shouldn't be so anti-Semitic by talking about Palestinians, right? Which is one of those red herrings that gets brought out. We're actually just going to bring the DA in, right? And not only that, we don't even have to bring him in. The DA is just going to appear and make this symbolic coercive statement, right? That is actually just not even mediated. It just becomes a felony charge. So it's that kind of vacillation that I'm talking about that I think actually adds another layer to the Cold War legacy of the academy and university and disciplines.
I actually just want to go back to the comments you were making concerning the university not necessarily being as easily or straightforwardly co-opted in the neoliberal state project. I'd like to disagree and be a little bit careful about that, because if the university hasn't necessarily been co-opted into that project, I don't think anything has been co-opted into that project neatly. And to say that dissent, or sort of like keep the existence of an organized group of people who ideologically oppose neoliberalism exists, doesn't necessarily mean the university isn't co-opted into that project, and also to be wary of perhaps the terms and the categories that we use in this conversation, in the sense that there seems to be a little bit of a romanticization of the university, where because we have coherent ideological positions and oppositions, we are less easily co-opted into neoliberalism. I think that there are groups, there was an earlier conversation about organic intellectuals and intellectuals that came out of activism, and I think that people, regardless of sort of a degree or an institution, are capable of coming to different decisions about what neoliberalism means and the extent to which they are co-opted to it, and awareness does not mean the ability to not be co-opted to it, or the means or the motive necessarily. But I think we should also pay attention to that.
Yeah.
This reminds me of how important it is, I think, hearing from many different people on the panel and those who work to question the discipline as the necessary site for any intellectual production that we want to approve of or support. Because that word is so protean, right? And so the word should, I think, in this conversation be evoking all of the forms of discipline that placing that then condition and effectively control our ability to think outside of a disciplinary project by participating in it. I mean, as someone who's been participating for the better part of 20 years in the critique of anthropology from the inside of the discipline, I'm aware that I still have radical ethnographers to look to for inspiration and for modeling for how I want to practice ethnography in a radical fashion. But I've never held a job in an anthropology department, and I think that's one of the reasons why is because my work has been explicitly naming, when I make my applications to these departments, my distrust of the discipline as a site through which my ethnographic practice can be contained. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you get a job in the anthropology department that you didn't make my argument, or that the work is containable in that. And so I want to be clear that that's not an implication of what I just said. But I am reminding myself in this moment area studies, development studies, the application of anthropology in those modes, feminist and queer studies, women's studies, LGBTQ studies, that are set up as projects to empower highly educationally privileged students to become, to use Dylan's language, to become administrators, or basically effectively incarcerators, of others by using disciplinary knowledge to go out and reproduce what Chandra Mohanty critiqued 25 years ago in Western feminism, producing a third world, a female subject for its to produce white Western feminism as the savior of the world's problems. And I'm kind of rambling, so I'm just saying that I really agree with the threading here of not necessarily, I love Jeff's warning, not necessarily falling into the trap of thinking that there's going to be one easy target that we're going to be able to point at and say that's going to consolidate all of our need to critique and to transform the institutions in which we're situated. But I am quite wary about presuming that the disciplinary power that produces our capacity to think in an academic context is ever going to be the context that's going to unthink and fundamentally transform its disciplinary effects in the world. This is one of the reasons why I really feel like I have to hold myself accountable to knowledges that did not emerge in an academic context, that entered the academic context in order to disrupt its naturalized conditions of knowledge production, adapt the academic context to sometimes, in the gaps and the fissures that are created, to produce differently epistemological, differently methodological knowledge in those spaces, but never to think that that knowledge necessarily belongs in the academy first or last, and understanding that it's part of a much broader project of radical social transformation. So just to kind of keep one, I completely agree with that. I want to see activist work going in academic knowledge production.
Well, this is sort of, this to sort of the question, we've laid out some of the historical changes and attempting to kind of historicize not only the academy, but the very dichotomies that we've been dealing with today: academia and activism, theory and praxis, ivory tower, real world. And I want to put that out there, and also the question of how have these historical changes reoriented, or have they reoriented scholarship? So, you know, on the level of the university, we can talk about its various functions, but either from your positions or from everyone's positions, can you link that to possibilities of reorienting scholarship?
I mean, I think to go back to the notion of being in a relationship of theft with the university. I mean, what I was going to add to that is that for some of us, our position to the university is already structurally a relation of theft. You know, I'm chair of an ethnic studies department, and even to the extent that it's an institutionalized part of the university, it's always assumed that it's in a relation of at best appropriative contingency, right? We have to justify our existence every year, where sociology does not, right? At the level of scholarship, then it becomes a question of to what extent does an intellectual practice that's already in a relation of theft with the university attempt to rearrange and deform itself to be legible to that same university, that same exploitive and oppressive university, and to what extent then that in its interdisciplinariness actually reinforces the hegemony and dominance of the discipline. So actually what I was going to say is that for those of us who exist in a relation of structural theft with the university, I actually think the obligation is to anti-disciplinary. I mean, I think the word people will use is interdisciplinary, which is fine, but I'm all for intellectual work that is anti-disciplinary.
What does that mean?
What it means is fraud. You know what I mean? I mean, in the sense that it might actually just be read as illegible within the academic site.
Put it in the active voice, because I don't get it.
Okay, anti-disciplinary, right? For example, to work from an epistemological foundation that does away with the liberal humanist subject, right? To work from a different kind of subjective position as far as what, you know, in other words, to work from a subject position that is in an intimacy, let's say, with genocidal terror, and to think about how knowledge comes from a subject position that's located in that kind of an intimacy is entirely anti-disciplinary as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but why is it wrong?
Well, you know, I'm being somewhat ironic and sarcastic. I'm saying as it's read from the disciplines, that seems illegitimate. It's seen as illegitimate scholarship. That's my point, right? That's not real scholarship, right? That's not real knowledge. You're coming from a kind of, you know, position of politicality, right? Which you know, real intellectual, real scholarship does not. So I'm just kind of moving with the kind of allegory of illegality, which is not so much of an allegory, right? What I'm trying to reach for in my anti-disciplinary gesture is the form of knowledge that can bring that into a different register so that it's understood as a state of emergency, right? And so I know being anti-disciplinary doesn't mean that I'm going to get rid of the disciplines. Cool, whatever, right? I'm putting it out there as a political impulse that will be in very productive tension with.
Maybe we can take Claire. Did you?
Yeah, I want to stick with the whole question of money for a little while, because one of the things I think about a lot is the level to which, when attacked, academics tend to defend themselves rather than look more broadly at the enterprise and think about the nature of the attack. And I'm thinking, this will seem like an odd segue, but I'm thinking about an article I read in the New York Times about the defunding of a series of teams at the University of California, Berkeley, which threw Berkeley out of compliance with Title IX. And of course, as a feminist, I'm like, this is horrible, somebody has to do something about it. And indeed, the athletic department is going back into compliance by committing to raising $100 million to support these teams, instead of saying, why don't you raise $100 million to support the English department, right? And that one of the places we go when certain kinds of knowledge are articulated as unnecessary to the 21st century, why have literature, why have ethnic studies, why have any of these things, is we defend what we do as knowledge production, right? Rather than saying, let's look at this big picture. Under what conditions is women's lacrosse essential to the mission of the University of California? Okay? And so I think one of the things to think about is the extent to which, under pressure, academics have a tendency to defend what they do rather than turn the question to the structures itself and ask another kind of question entirely. And questions that will be at odds with some of our other commitments. I mean, it is at odds with my commitment as a feminist to say, what does women's lacrosse have to do with anything, right? But in fact, it's a good question to ask.
I mean, this is another way of saying my kind of impulse, right, is to say that to the extent that a certain kind of a social science scholarship will bring us the knowledge of what is going on in terms of social inequality that's both created and reproduced by foreclosures, right, and predatory home loans, right. I'm saying that to the extent that becomes the paradigm that explains how the phenomenon took place, it's not only insufficient, it's actually damaging, right, in this way. From what little I know of the condition of possibility for what created black and brown foreclosures, it's because people were trying to escape criminalization and civil death. Right, and that's not captured by the language of social inequality, or by this. I'm talking about the epistemological and ontological position that precedes the move of accepting predatory, of seeking and then being subjected to predatory home loans. Right, I'm talking about a social condition that says the reason that this situation has occurred is not adequately explained by predatory pursuit of vulnerable consumers. Right? It's actually explained by a social fabric that designates particular populations for criminalization and effective social neutralization. And so that there's a kind of desperate maneuvering that takes place, which subjects people to another layer of what we otherwise call social science and social inequality.
So I want to just sort of put, as a philosopher, I'm going to try to see this little debate going on and put it back to what Janet was saying earlier about the sort of possibilities that we engage in when we're thinking about these things and practical necessity, because it seems that's where the problem is. And it's simply a necessity and an emergency in many instances to be able to translate some kinds of political concerns through social scientific information to funding agencies to get emergency care or whatever taken care of right here and now. And that doesn't mean that you can't also at the same time be trying to change the political discourse. It's simply I think this is what Janet was saying earlier, it's a hard thing to try to do both. I was last week at the CUNY Senate's trying to organize or try to think about ways of getting prison education after the Pell Grants went away. And there's a big debate going on amongst the movement for prison education about changing the discourse from social scientific questions about recidivism and reform to a much more important, interesting moral discussion about sort of the waste of intellectual and other value that is the prison industrial complex. So, but the issue then is that the activists on the ground are trying to get funding for these issues, and they're not going to get that funding if they're not able to speak in the language of recidivism. So the real difficulty is trying to take the social scientific data and providing the space for scholars and activists to work together to move political imagination into emergency aid, necessary politics. So it's not either or, I think, is what I want to suggest. It doesn't have to be an either or.
Just running kind of part about the kind of positionality of the academic of the intellectual. And so far we've stayed within that position, right? So either we're counting and then getting funding, or we're changing the epistemological conditions under which we count or whatever. But the people who are missing from the conversation are the ones whose thousands have been closed on, who are actually feeling the force of the state in its ideological or coercive version. Is there a way of talking about that? I'll just pose this question. That could be productive for us? Because it seems like stealing from the university in all its forms, great. Yeah.
I'm glad there's such consensus on that point. It's not true that they don't have any money. They have tons more money than many of these activist organizations, and plus you get paychecks. So if you look at radical organizations, I'm sorry, but you have to take seriously, if you're in the academy at any level, you get a paycheck. And that, I mean, in the radical organizations in New York City, Queers for Economic Justice, FEARS, the heads of these organizations are going to graduate school. And why? Because they hope for a sustainable life by going to graduate school, and they hope to be able to do radical work while still having a sustainable life, because it's very hard to be an ED of a small organization, get paid nothing, try to live in New York City, and work all the time for such a low rate. So I am not willing to accept, and I grew up in at the University of Iowa, I used to teach at the University of Arizona, that there are no resources even in institutions that are not the elite institutions, and that those resources are often resources of the state that can again be diverted to projects that are not the state intended projects. And there's space. Space alone is really important to activist organizations, and there's also letterhead. A lot of what I'm serious. We did a whole thing. I've been working with Amber Hollabaugh on a project called Desiring Change for a long time, and we did a whole thing about the question of what do activists most want. And her big thing is letterhead. So we put Barnard Center for Research on Women like all over their stuff. Because again, it gives you a legitimacy that is really crucial. Or if you take in New York, the Harlem Children's Bureau, which I would argue is a neoliberal regressive project, it's studied by everybody, and it's especially studied by Harvard. And they then walk around as the answer to a social problem based on Harvard University's imprimatur.
So we could send Harvard and Columbia letterhead, from the academy to people who are fighting their own struggles that are not ours. I think this is what I was getting at. Right? Like, so what are we providing besides aid? Right? When we're either providing letters or a critique of a racist ideological discourse. I mean, is there a way of translating that? I mean, sort of carrying that to the people that you're talking about? Because, and this is part of what we were talking about this morning, right? There's a kind of pathos in the expression, right? Either the counting or the reworking the discourse that actually is massively disconnected, or only connected through the language of aid. Right?
Well, I don't agree with that, and perhaps I misspoke on the way that these projects work, and I would go back to Mara's point from the morning. These are collaborative projects that are about producing things together that we both need and that we hope will transform the world. So that's very different than aid. But if we don't think of those projects in terms of material resources and take that seriously, which is to say that to pretend that we're doing something that is not about transfers of capital, I also think is misleading. And that's where, to me, the sort of what we were talking about as the romance, and I was trying to turn into sexual attraction of this kind of work, can flip over into fetishism, alienation, and Dylan wanted to push that even further to hostility. So I think that being serious about the question of both the fact that you have a paycheck if you are an academic, and then where your paycheck comes from. I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot are there are three types of institutions in the United States. They are either state-sponsored, church-sponsored, or they're private corporations. That means that, we're all going to be complicit no matter what we do with one of those three forms of capital flow.
The conditions of our labor have altered so dramatically during the course of my career. And, for example, all of these universities that are opening satellite campuses in places like Singapore and Abu Dhabi and so on, which are, about making money, but which also contribute to the shift in the terms of our labor because they're being entirely staffed by non-tenure track contract labor, which is available in bulk because tenure lines have been cut everywhere. And there's a deep resistance on the part of academics to rethink the conditions to which some of us have privileges, to think about the ways in which those privileges are actually undoing the larger workplace and being used to divide us and undo the larger workplace. So I'm with you. I mean, I don't think we're even capable of organizing in our self-interest, which would make us very different from people like janitors and home health care workers and so on, who have a much more sophisticated sense both of class interest and a much more sophisticated sense of how the fate of the individual is tied to the fate of the group.
Well, and this is where I would want to go back again to push us toward the question of vision and imagination, because I always worry when people start talking about interests, because they become very narrowly defined, they become located in some self, and that always worries me because of the ways in which it can present some idea of either, stratified classes that don't actually exist or individuals that don't actually exist, which is, it's not, to me, a question of whose interest is the organizing happening in, as what's the larger project. And that's what I hear you pushing us towards in both your comments here, which is, but one, what's just the larger project of this self-interest? What's the larger project that is leading to this biometric insanity? I'm sorry, I know Dylan was all for swearing, but I'm trying to cut back. So I'll go with insanity, and what's the larger project in which we might participate? And again, I think that's a crucial thing for thinking about the relationships between activist organizations and the academy, where my stealing thing, the problem about it is when we take seriously the imbalances in power and resources, then we get involved in all kinds of real complexities. And yet the way to deal with those is not necessarily at that level, but at the level of larger project. And when we don't talk about that larger project, I feel like we get trapped in any number of places that disable rather than enable action.
Well, and if I could just add on to that, and to come back to my first comment about why we aren't willing to raise money for English departments, when university presidents say, and they now say quite openly now, English is irrelevant, the humanities are irrelevant, what they're talking about is getting rid of departments, and what they're talking about is getting rid of full-time labor. They're not actually talking about getting rid of the courses, okay, which will be taught in these sort of large amalgam humanities departments by people who work for $6,000 or $7,000 a semester or less. And so, I think these kinds of larger changes, part of what we have to look at is how the actual shape of the workplace is changing to suit a project of division among formerly professional people.
Students are considered consumers, right. And we work for you, and we're supposed to, the university kind of pitch it in a consumerist model as opposed to what kind of radical education might be possible. How are educators supposed to prepare you for the job market? And where, in this sort of highly competitive, super pressured situation where the globe is coming and taking your job, and what are you going to do about it? That makes you think of yourself as an individual and makes you think of us as somebody who's supposed to train you to be technocrats in the machine. So that's, I think, how it gets played out, and these larger global forces kind of permeate what happens in the academy. And so, do you feel that, or is that just been widely your experience, or has that not been your experience at all? Or
this is a very small scale thing, and I'm not sure if it's at all relevant. But having only gone to college now, I don't know if this is a change, but I know we have a small grocery store, and it's privately owned, is it not? So I don't know. It definitely, I think, having spoken to my grandmother about what college was when she went, it seems as if there are not that college was ever a completely kind of isolated community, but it seems like you kind of feel that there are people or corporations, things coming in, and that you're not existing. You're not giving your money back to the school. It's not going back into its coffers, and it's providing things. It's going here. It's getting on the truck and going out of wherever you're studying.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I think just in my experience at Wesleyan, the strongest I felt just talking about the privatization of my education was when I was applying and when I was being recruited to other schools. And I think that once I got here, it sort of disappeared, just the perception of it. And I think that might just be a function of the fact that this is a school of very privileged people. And I know just friends from home, and also I come from Philadelphia, for example, Drexel University, which is a private university, but the average student there is much less well off than at Wesleyan, for example. And there's advertisements everywhere. A new president came in a couple years ago. He's no longer the president, but he started changing the way that the school was like, so many more things were online, whether for full-time residential students, but also just like so many people were being taken in and like recruited for all these different like laborless forms of education. And I think that maybe it's just hidden from us here because of who we, basically what we pay and who goes here, but I don't think that it's kind of not here.
In addition to what Steve said, like when you were looking at the schools as a prospective student, I remember like larger universities put a premium on their idea of job preparation as one of their key factors, and then you look at the small liberal arts school, and they say that it's the exact opposite. They put a premium on liberal arts education as something that jobs and companies will look for. And I think that when getting to Wesleyan, to go about that activism thing, there's a term that my parents talk about all the time, and that I hear from other students, slacktivism, in that for a university with sort of a rich activist and dissident, so to speak, history, and the fact that my generation sort of is very complacent in terms of a lot of social issues and trying to solve them via, our really great technology with instantaneous communication sort of thing, is that it's a very different environment from what I guess it would have been like maybe during the end of the Cold War or the 60s when people left. So that's what I think. It's like been in college for a number of months.
Well, I was just going to add on to that is that I definitely felt it the most when I was looking at schools, and I had this thing where I was looking at all the same school. And everywhere I would go, these information sessions, they would say like, and why are we different from everywhere else? It's almost branding. Yeah, it almost seemed like what you were saying with like how like the job market, preparing for the job market, it's like sponsored by Google. Like you can go here and then like streamline you straight into here, but like liberal arts education is sort of different, but we're different from all the other small liberal arts schools that you're looking at, which was difficult. But yeah, but I also feel like it's faded since I've gotten here, or it's just disguised.
Yeah, just as in terms of students feeling like a consumer, I actually, in like the beginning of this semester, I felt it a lot in choosing classes because, a lot of times what I would hear was, well, I'm paying so much money, so why am I not filling my course load to the maximum? Like, why am I not taking harder classes? So, like, I see so many students taking these, like, really rigorous courses where they can't even keep up because they need to get the maximum education that they think they can get for their money, which is defeating the purpose of, like, the true value of their education.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of precisely off of that. I think a lot of times the student, your experience of sort of neoliberalization of the academy is less. I take it from our professors that it feels often like it's this thing coming down. For students, I feel like it's something we've grown up in, and like the neoliberal consumer is responsible as a consumer. We don't come here and like put out our money and say, "You got to give me intelligence." We are expected to participate in the formation of ourselves in a particular way, which allows us then to enter the job market with a particular set of skills, which are conditioned such that we can find the right job and be good citizens and responsible and free.
Dylan, did you have a...
I don't want to interrupt the discourse of students. So.
Monica, did you want to... No?
I think that one of the ways that faculty can possibly help students who have these sort of radical activist ideals is, instead of gearing us towards being accessible consumers within our system that we live in, is to help us understand how to maintain our ideals and our beliefs while living inside a hypocritical environment.
When we figure that out, we'll tell you.
I'm saying that, it's really hard to take a class seriously that's really critical of neoliberalism or globalization and to sit in a class and hear it and really think it, and then go out into the world and buy your fair trade coffee on a campus that's covered in Coca-Cola products and Bank of America, and greenwashing corporations and an administration that tokenizes activism in its public sphere while simultaneously stonewalling every attempt you can possibly have and waiting for the next summer break or waiting for the 4-year turnover. And it's really hard to actually keep up your energy and to keep yourself feeling like you're actually doing something that makes any sense whatsoever. And I think that if we can learn to exist in a hypocritical way, and still maintain who we are, I feel like that would help. And I don't know, right now that's not really happening. I think
you can't.
I don't know about that.
You can't, and you shouldn't. I mean, in terms of being ethical, but you can't tolerate the world as it is. I mean, I can't counsel you to do that. I can't, and I won't.
No, I think you're saying the
I'm
opposite.
saying, no, you have to live in a state of permanent antagonism. That's what I'm trying to get at.
I thought you said the opposite.
No. Yeah, well, that's the other side of it, right? It's like surrender.
Right.
You know what I mean? I feel like I sell out every damn day. I mean, I really do, because and that's why the only way to not be that, there's no way to reach that state of I don't know, coherence. You can't really be a coherent being if you take the principles seriously that you're inferring.
But I just think in that same vein, we are very much encouraged to be activists in ways and do projects and be part of projects that are ultimately really benign. I was in this class with Michael Brock, and he was talking about Teach for America and described it as a program that was designed to keep young people from being frustrated with their government by doing something that makes them feel like they're being productive without actually doing anything productive. And it's really evident when you look across the sort of activities board that we have at Wesleyan and student groups. A lot of them are activist-based, but they have to go through this bureaucratic system that is the academy, and in fact, absolutely no change whatsoever, but make their students feel like they're being active. And so I just want to know what it is that you hope we take away from this in that vein, that how do we become this actual kind of activist body with all these blocks?
And the problem I'm having is with the circuitry itself between this right and left. Because they're both my problems.
Right.
And in fact, my more immediate problem is with the left part of that, the liberal part of the circuitry. Because that's what I see more. So my problem is much more with the part that's not smashing down on you saying don't be activists. My problem is with the way in which you are taught to be activists. Which actually you articulate better than I did. I mean, when Teach for America becomes the horizon of like a bright, a bright, critically thinking, analytical, political subject, right, in their young adulthood, then we have some serious problems.
I mean, I think there are a lot of things to say about the difficulty of maintaining this life and getting it down to something that you all can take away with you. But so I have two things to say. One, first of all, you're at college. So ask yourself, why are you at college? What does college have to offer you? Which is to say that we all, in our activist practice, I do, and in fact the activists that I work with, depend on an analysis that comes from a long genealogy that you can learn if you are proactive in the way you approach your education at this school. They read Marx, they read Gramsci, they read Althusser. This is actually helpful. These texts can be very helpful to you. But this is your chance to do that analytic work, and don't throw it away thinking that you're wasting your time and should be really doing something else. But I would suggest that if you want to do that in a way that's going to be actually helpful as opposed to leading you to another dead end, which is what you're describing, is that what the university sets up for students these days are a lot of dead ends. And the busier you are heading toward that dead end, the better, right? That's professional managerial class, that's neoliberalism. Busy, busy, busy. The busier you are while going to a dead end, that's perfection. They like that. So 1, take time off. 2, take your studies seriously. And then 3, try to connect that to something else. And this is to just take a point from Lori Gruen's soon-to-be published book, which is Ethics in Animals, and we're both ethicists. And she says, befriend an animal. Like, you want to be ethical in relation to animals, befriend an animal. Well, befriend an organization, befriend somebody outside the university with whom you can work, and then think, don't talk to them about it, think yourself and talk to your professors about how do you connect that to what you're learning in the classroom. Do intellectual labor, in other words, about how to connect those things. So that's what I have to say as the little takeaway moment.
I was going to add, by invoking the elephant in the room, which is neoliberalism and race, and particularly neoliberalism and its effect on the way in which Wesleyan is a white and white supremacist institution. Because I think the way that neoliberalism has worked is to relegate race to the cultural, and then to relegate cultural to the terrain that is outside the political. So we all know, if we're discerning people, that the cultural is entirely political, but that's not the way neoliberalism works. It works to relegate racial antagonism outside the field of antagonism and into the rhetorics of diversity and difference, to therefore compartmentalize it, depoliticize it, and then to mark it out so that in institutions like this, the categories of race, class, sexuality, and gender get seen as commensurate markers of human difference and not as social antagonisms that you're already located in, that you don't choose to engage, you're already engaged in. Right? So at a place like the university, most universities, you choose to be in the LGBT organization, in the Asian Pacific American organization. You choose to engage with indigenous sovereignty discourses and struggles and what. It becomes a volunteer. Activism becomes a voluntarism, right? And I'm saying the logic of the neoliberal multiculturalist university is precisely to render those forms of antagonism such that you can either choose or not choose to involve yourself in. And my point is that you're already in it. Right? You're already in it. You're already in. I mean, the way I talk about it with race, right? It's already a white supremacist institution. The question is how it's done that, how it's accomplished in a way that actually makes it fairly livable. Right? It's not an irreconcilable antagonism. It's just a marker of difference.
But, I'd like to suggest there is some way that faculty would help students in this. And one thing would be to take a stand against credentialing, which we don't do. I agree with you. We have spent several decades protecting ourselves from the right. That being said, I think the left has been very complicit in certain kinds of changes that allow colleges and universities to market themselves in ways that suit neoliberalism, and one of which is credentialing. If students were not so busy double majoring, getting a certificate in this, getting a certificate in that, being in the college of this, being in the college of that, being in any number of kinds of honors programs. I mean, we create a whole structure, and we're very complicit in creating these structures because, it helps us do other things. It furthers projects we're invested in. It allows us to hire people and so on. But we create this very dense field of activity for students within which there's really no hope of them acquiring interests of their own that are independent of what the university is demanding of them. And I do think that's something that faculty need to take seriously. I think we also need to start taking seriously the ways in which students are proletarianized in the interests of the university. Specifically on things like football teams, in which large numbers of young men are taking, lifelong injuries. I think it's ironic that a place like Wesleyan, where we are supposedly developing people's intellect, is sending people out of here with brain injuries that will ultimately make them stupider and stupider. And I'm not saying that to make fun of people, it's simply true. And so I do think faculty, to a certain extent, need to talk to students more seriously about the ways in which they are used to sell the university, and in which they are being co-opted and proletarianized in the interest of a project that's really not about educating them.
We've talked a little bit about our scholarship. We've talked a lot about the impact of these kinds of historical changes on students, and a little bit about on our work. But I wonder if we could locate that, at least from the panelist perspective, in our classrooms. I would love to hear students' response, but first I want to hear panelists' response about how you see the classroom as an activist space, what possibilities you see in your classrooms, or what kinds of closing downs.
Because I think, on the one hand, I think it means pedagogies are that there needs to, that there's kind of a necessary embrace of the pedagogical as experimental, in the dangerous sense, not in the kind of quaint and exotic sense, but in the sense of, you're actually playing with fire, right? And your intent sometimes doesn't matter in the classroom. This is, I think, maybe one source of uneasiness, right? That you're trying to provoke a certain kind of response, and you can't actually anticipate what the response is going to be. So, I can be more concrete about it this way. My dilemma is how to deal with I teach at UC University of California, Riverside, where majority of the student population is students of color. I think white students constitute, I think, less than 23 or 24% of the population. So I'm dealing with this climate in which diversity is the calling card of this so-called research institution. But I'm also dealing with a situation in which the chancellor actually entertains the notion that because white students are a minority on campus, that we should have a white student union. Right? I mean, this is the neoliberal racial logic. Right? When racial difference just gets compartmentalized and equilibrated, that's what we deal with in the classroom. Right? And then on the other hand, what we're also dealing with are students of color who don't identify their social subjectivity with any sense of political obligation. Right? It's another reflection of the neoliberal multiculturalist logic, right? It's a marker of difference, which in essence is maybe part of what got me here or what represses me here, but it's not something that carries with it a historical freight of absolute political obligation to engage in a certain kind of politics. And I don't even have a platform for that. I don't even agenda or, you know what I mean, or kind of formula for how the politics gets engaged. But I'm saying in terms of understanding social subjectivity of historically, oppressed and dominated and colonized and enslaved people as bearing something obligatory with it, that's, I think, something that's been fairly successfully evacuated by the neoliberal multicultural project. So at the very least, an interdisciplinary project like ethnic studies can embrace that project and to find all different kinds of experimental and dangerous ways to ignite that sense of political obligation, at least, because that's, I think, the condition of possibility for anything else to happen. Otherwise we're pissing in the wind. You can't talk about activism unless there's a sense of political obligation. Otherwise, it's a volunteerism.
It was proposed, I think it was from the Harvard Crimson, that everyone who got the rejection letter, they say, we think that over 3/4 of the people who applied here are more than qualified to do our work. However, we don't have space, whatever, politics you can't come. But, so I think the proposal was to take whatever that group is, the top 75%, if you're truly saying they're all qualified, and randomize the process and draw a lottery, and then destigmatize the whole admissions thing.
I'm saying fuck qualification. That's the horizon of political imagination I'm actually interested in.
We used to do it.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying.
Before it came down, there was a real excitement at the few places that did it, and the places that didn't do it opened their admission much more than anybody would dream of today. There wasn't all of the appurtenances and the rigmarole you would go through in applying to a college. You would apply to a college. You didn't even pay an admission fee.
Imagine that.
Now you pay staggering amounts of money just to file something on the net or a piece of paper. And it was assumed, yes, the whole assumption was higher education ought to be open to everybody in the country, and schools were free. CUNY was free. UC, the whole UC and CSU systems were, CSU I think was Cal State's, were free. And UC's, when I got there, it was called student fees, it was tuition. They were very low, something like $500 a quarter. Now I think it's $5,000 a quarter. And it's going up by a third every year. Not because you want to know why tuition is going up. I can tell you why it's going up in the UCs. It's right out there. There's supposed to be a firewall. You're not supposed to use public money and tuition money for construction. They say they're done. They just justify to the bankers, and it's in their printed material, that we are backing our bonds by tuition fees. And we're doing it in order to pay a lower bond rate of interest. Now, if that isn't using state money and extorting students to pay outrageous amounts of a supposedly public institution, set of institutions, I don't know what is. So this is how far in my teaching career we've come from a time at which public universities were seen to be as open as possible. That was a public, did they walk the walk? No, but they talked the talk. It was a publicly okay kind of discourse. The discourse you're facing now is there should be no public, let the market rule everything. That's why you have the Coke logos, why you have private restaurants in student unions. That's why all of that happens. There's a theory behind it. It's false, doesn't matter. And that is what's driving credentialing, commoditization of your degree, the way you put your resume together to show that you're well-rounded. You're done good by somebody disadvantaged. You have a heart. You have a head. You know better than I how to put these things together because you've had to do it. And you're now a walking commodity. You sell yourself. It's a terrible system, and if you just watching the transformation over a relatively small number of decades, it is really terrifying to me. There is no public. I mean, I think Jeffrey Dylan said, we're not citizens anymore. Citizens, even citizen is narrow. We're not members of a polity with a shared responsibility and equally shared rights. That's gone with this logic of the market. And that's the story that underlies neoliberalism. And we talk like that. You can't take my money for taxes. It's mine. I got my profit. I still live fair and square. It's mine. There's no hour. There's no responsibility. Unless you volunteer for something. But you don't have to.
So, I think the reaction that a lot of students have had just in this past 10 minutes, they actually point to some of the possible solutions for the issue of what to do in the classroom. And so I'm a senior and an anthropology major here, and I think the anthropology department does quite a good job at this.
Yeah, you've been brainwashed.
Oh yeah, definitely. No, but the sense that more or less the proximate project for the purposes of understanding, if not for the next step, which are probably more important, but I need to do this first one, is sort of provincializing in the temporal sense the current situation. So the sense that just knowing that there were different ways and they weren't that long ago. It's one thing to be a history major and study Greece and be they had a whole different system of morality and it's weird how things change. It's another thing to be in an anthropology class and be 20 years ago, people didn't really say this. And you're oh, okay. And these are the kind of things that aren't so far in the past or so far out of left field that you can't then find a way to see how they make sense. They're not utterly unthinkable to you. But understanding the sort of geniality of these kind of sets of processes, neoliberalism, what we keep talking about, often helps you take just the first step back and say okay, so if for my parents it wasn't like this, then for their parents it probably wasn't that either. And you can end up exploiting a whole lot of assumptions rapidly.
Because I really want to encourage students who have any kind of activist passion to get it started. Yeah. Because I'm in my 11th year here, and when I interviewed for the position in February 2000, I was in Professor Potter's office and saw the students on the steps of North College for the Janitors for Justice movement holding a massive rally, and we could barely interview because of the bullhorn. And I looked out the window and I said, wow, what's going on? I said, oh, they're organizing the right, help pushing on the administrations working with the janitors to be able to unionize. And I was well, I want to come to a place where that's happening because I did undergrad at UC Berkeley. And that's the kind of stuff I was used to as an undergrad, and I wanted to work with students doing that. And from my perspective, and my colleagues might disagree with me, and students that know me might be really sick of hearing this from me, but I feel like activism almost has died entirely on this campus. And for me, the real pivot moment was when chalking was banned in 2002 under President Bennett, where students weren't allowed to chalk on the sidewalks. And I'm chalking We carried latex gloves to make sure that the spray paint didn't come out on our index fingers when we put the spray paint can back in our jacket. So chalking is banned, and it killed queer activism on this campus and all the intersecting racial politics that were going on at the time. Now, there's good work being done. I don't want to demean the good stuff that's happened with the students this year who have really come out for Wesleyan's compliance with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and also the students working to make sure that to try and fight everybody getting the same amount of insurance increases across the board, whether they're a high-level administrator or a secretary or a janitor. And there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's very quiet, it's very mild. And I do feel peace in the classroom. I feel like it is that connection between the neoliberal economic policies with the neoconservative social orientation that a lot of our students have, in the same way that people think that we live in a colorblind society. A lot of my students think that I'm supposed to be politically neutral in the classroom. Mm-hmm. Well, good luck with that, because I teach Native sovereignty politics and U.S. colonialism in the Pacific Islands on the one hand, and on the other hand, I teach U.S. intro to U.S. racial formations and methodologies in critical race studies. So guess what? Surprise, I'm anti-racist and I'm anti-colonialism. How do you teach a history of broken treaties and not take a political position? Mm-hmm. You know, she's very outward with her political perspectives, and that's because they want, at Wesleyan these days, the diversity debate on the Wesleyan is, do the Republicans have enough page space in the campus newspaper? That's what it's come down to.
Well, that's the
not one.
That's your version of the white student.
That's right. Not one student protested when Benny Morris came to campus to talk. He was a rabid Zionist. I was the only faculty person that was there that protested. It was all community people, and I was the only Wes person on Wesleyan campus when Benny Morris came. Ward Connerly came here last semester, and some students tried to mobilize around it because there were some anti-affirmative action bake sales on campus, and a student put out a great message with weeks' notice that Ward Connerly was coming to campus. The very first email practically was the Vice President of Academic Affairs, Rob Rosenthal, who said, I'd hate to see any protests. You shouldn't protest this event. I'd sure hate to see anything. He has freedom of speech, and, you know, we all have to respect each other's positions. And it's like, what? And the students think that. They say, well, we know we have to respect everyone's. It's like, what? What? You don't have to respect everything. What are you talking about? But what killed me is nobody protested Ward Connerly coming to campus. Nobody. There was not one sign. And to me, I thought, well, why? He said, you should stack it inside so that people ask strategic questions. Well, when I was coming up, what would happen was you stack it inside and you get everybody in there to ask the critical questions. Then you picket the event from the outside, and you call a press conference, and as I've said in the anarchist article, and then you get the anarchist students to pie the fucker at the microphone.
That's intolerant. That seems intolerant.
Those were the days.
Look, I've been shut down at 2 marches.
Yeah.
I was scolded by students who said my chants were too rowdy at Take Back the Night, and I was supposed to be quiet and crying or something. And then at the march after 9/11, when we marched down to Main Street, I got shushed because my chants, because I like to make up chants and I'm really loud, were too anti-Bush. At Wesleyan. How Wesleyan has this reputation, I don't know.
Oh, just real quick. That makes me think of, I taught one of the largest classes on campus last quarter, the Introduction to Ethnic Studies class, and this is up in the midst of a kind of rising swell of activism in Arizona, right, both around SB 1070, but also around the less talked about 2281, which was the bill that was meant to basically eviscerate ethnic studies. Mm-hmm. So there was a number of organizers around that from Arizona that were in town, and a grad student that I worked with knew them. And so I brought them to I didn't send the students out. I brought organizers into the class, and I said, this is our lesson today. And they came, and there was nothing disguised about it. This was about kind of unveiling exactly what was happening in Arizona, articulating a position, analyzing the policy, and I tested the students on it. I said, this isn't extra credit, this is mandatory. You have to be there for this. There's something on my campus called the free speech mound. It's like this lump of grass with a little bit of cement on top that nobody ever goes to because it's in the middle of the sun that people go to, and it's like the protected free speech. I'm like, y'all can go there. But the classroom's my space. I'll be sectarian. My point is that it's dangerous because I don't know that I'm not going to turn these students against the position, because 550 students. And they're not radical students. A lot of them business administration majors, most of them. They're taking this because they have to. They actually kind of hate me. You know what I mean? I mean, students of color too, right? They're like, I'm here because I have to be, and fuck you for giving me hard exams. So my point is that it's not a happy, safe experiment. It's actually scary as hell. You know, that you bring these folks in and you kind of tell them, this is not necessarily a friendly audience. I don't know if they're hostile, but I don't know. I just don't know, right? But they come, and in this case, it was I think it was a good outcome. Like, the students were just blown away. They didn't know, and there was some kind of ideological shifting that needed to happen. But
yeah, I would just say that I think that you were talking earlier about the differences in the way people go about organizing, if they do it at all. And I think it comes to bear back in what Dylan said at the very beginning, which is that there has been a change in the possible consequences for certain activities. You know, I think the fear is that you hire a speaker and you get charged with assault. Whereas I think there was a time in history where you find the speaker and they would go, don't do that. Don't do that. You know. And I also think there's been a sense that your presentation of yourself as like a product, it comes out when people start talking about don't drink beer on Facebook. There's like a sense that you can permanently mar your ability to be a functional human and live the life you hope to lead by doing something that is sanctioned. And I think it also ends up tying into these shifts in focus of activism that happened really in the second half of the 90s about, like, you know, what is the goal of activism? And it ended up being like, well, if you're not talking about tactics, you're not talking. And if you're talking about tactics, that means you can't say something that's truly radical, because you have to say, well, we know, you know, most people feel this. And you build up this conception of like the average folk. Yep. And they're not really that radical. So you need to frame it in terms that they're comfortable with. And end up taking the level of discourse from like, let's pie someone to, well, if we phrase it as a question and it's just a little searching, perhaps someone will spur the thinking. That kind of thing. And it's a little bit absurd, but it is. And then there's the other aspect, which is that for some people, the consequences that may come to bear if you're truly active are really a problem. There are people who really can't hold you for this.
It's also condescending. You know what I mean? Like the idea that, oh, most average people can't go with us this far. Well, how do you know those people come off as reactionary or conservative to you, but they're actually further to the left of you on a particular thing where if you just touch it, they're going to go with you toward police abolition, right? Because they hate the cops more than you. Yeah. And they can think of structures that'll protect themselves and their communities and their people better than you can. So they might seem conservative because they come off like, oh, we need better police or whatever, but as soon as you touch on it, they're like, no, we're passing on it.
So Janice wanted to say something for a little while. We can give her the last comment, and then we will move to the other room where there are cupcakes and continue the conversation.
Yeah, well, the pressure of the last comment is alleviated by the cupcake possibility. But what I did want to say about this is, it seems to me one of the things that has been developing in this room that's very encouraging to me is a conversation between faculty and students that I think is really important at this moment in particular, which is to say this: I learned to be an activist. People taught me. And they were, you know, I was an anti-apartheid activist in the 80s, and I traveled with the ANC. They had an analysis. It was very clear. It was very theoretical. And they also were really good organizers. And I learned. But it is also the case that I could not do things in the way that movement did things, because conditions changed. And I think conditions have changed very rapidly. And so that this, well, when, 10 years ago even, or, it's only, I guess, 9 since the chalking ban, things were different, is helpful in one way because it's ideas about things you can do. It goes to the provincialism of things temporally. But some kind of conversation amongst faculty and students is really crucial around what can happen now. Mm-hmm. What kind of protections can be offered to people who face what kind of dangers? How can we build those up collectively? And what kind of knowledges do we have? I think that we have some knowledge as faculty that is both analytic and has to do with genealogies of activism in which we've participated. And I think students have real knowledge about what the conditions are right now that is not so available to us because we have certain nostalgias about our own lives and perhaps even a little narcissism. Maybe. But anyway, I think that kind of conversation, like, I want to thank again both Mario and Naomi for organizing this, and maybe it's a starting point, not just on this campus, but on our campuses, for more conversation about this question. What can happen now under the current conditions that don't throw out the genealogies of activism, but that also don't presume that we could just go back to those kinds of things.